Guess who got brands talking? Brandlive.co.za.
It just got 11:30. You are listening to The Weekly with me, Sam Marshall. And as you know, on a Tuesday, we like to look at books and unpack, I like to call them issues. But, what was the author thinking when she put in that line? And I've got one of those questions I've got to ask Consuelo Rowland, who is the author of The Good Symmetry Guide and Lady Limbo. She is dished out part 2 of a trilogy. It's called Wolf Trap, and we're going to unpack it on the show this morning. Consuelo, thank you very much for joining me. Am I saying your name correctly, Consuelo?
Very good.
I feel like I've got to have an accent to like Consuelo.
Well, you're emphasizing the O, which is good. Because people have thought in the past that I'm a man, so it really does end in an O.
Okay, so there's a couple of surprise people when you rock up, right?
Absolutely.
Okay. We always start the segment first by, for the viewers who haven't read the book, to give them a brief synopsis of Wolf Trap. But I almost feel because it's a part of a trilogy, you've got to give us a little bit of a synopsis of Lady Limbo first, and then give us a synopsis of Wolf Trap, so that it kind of makes sense if you haven't read the books.
Lady Limbo starts with Paula Dante, who's a career woman. And there's this love triangle in her youth. Her soulmate returns. He's gone away because of a tragic accident. He returns. They get married. They have an apartment in Camps Bay. And one day he disappears out of their apartment. She comes home on a Friday night. She's just talked to him half an hour before, and he's vanished into thin air. And then she starts to look for him. She has the choice of thinking this man has gone AWOL and just forgetting him, or to go and find him. But she just can't leave it alone. She has to go, so she decides to try and find him. And she tries to find clues to the mystery of where he went. And she goes through all his stuff, and there's an unfinished manuscript that gives her quite a few clues. And then there's this incident in their youth that goes back to her finding an email. And she eventually realizes that email had a huge effect on all their lives. It was a turning point, and it triggered off a series of incidents which she wasn't even aware of, and basically affected his life and her life in the future. And she starts unraveling this. So Lady Limbo is about that. It's about finding out that he's got links to an organization in Brussels, in Belgium, which basically offers a natural way of having children. And so he's a practitioner for this organization. And so she actually goes through the portals, as it were, into this world of darkness to see if she can find him, to try and trace him. And so that's about that. And then there's also a child.
Yeah,
and
we're going to talk about
to
that
him.
child. Yeah.
Yes, and that child then follows through into Wolf Trap. So that's the book ends where with the child, and Wolf Trap picks up on the child that lives with her and their relationship. And she's moved from the state of the ordinary life to a life in peril all the time.
Before we talk about some of the central characters, I've got to ask you this question, just to touch on what you're saying, their relationship. I find the dynamic between Paolo and Simone weird. And I mean weird because it's as if Paolo is constantly negotiating herself with Simone. It's as if she's constantly trying, she has these moments where she tells her, I've got to be tough and I've got to stand up to Simone and she'll see my weakness. And then she's got this love for her that's, to the point that, many people would say that it's almost unnatural for an adopted mom to feel the way she does about this girl. Sorry, I used the wrong word. I just thought it's weird.
It's interesting. I think I have in my life experienced these strange moments where one is drawn to another person where you can't quite put your finger on it. And in fact, the first time that Paula becomes aware of Simone, she's sitting at the bus stop with a hoodie. So she's a very vulnerable teenager. And it also goes back to Paula's life. She was a very vulnerable teenager. A lot happened in her life at that stage. So I think that was the moment of recognition of someone who was going through trauma and difficult times as a teenager. But then there's also a photograph where this teenager is looking straight at the camera, and there's something in that gaze, in the look. And I find people's eyes are amazing. You know, there's some people you will be drawn to just for what you see in their eyes. And it's that moment of recognition where she's drawn to. And once you've sort of crossed that line where you give your love, I don't think you can ever take it back. You know, then it becomes something almost irrational. But I think in the end, it changes both their lives in a very significant way.
Yeah.
And it's interesting. I like that idea of them negotiating their relationship, because I think that's more healthy than one of you withdrawing, if you know what I mean. And it is a very difficult situation to take on a teenager when you've declared categorically you don't want to have any children, and you're this career woman who's got her life all sorted out. But I also think it's part of Paula's courage, where it gives meaning to life to have that kind of courage, to put yourself out there and say, I'm going to give this my all.
We'll talk about those moments of courage, but I want to kind of talk more about this relationship between Paula and Simone, because, you know, a couple of times, as I read the book, it felt to me like Paula herself is not sure about Simone. And then there was a point in the book where I was really cross with you, because, you know, you explained there's this boy called Sam, and he's got a combi, and he's living with his rich aunt, and then they play in the water. And then you describe the way the older gentleman was looking at Simone in a very sexual way. And then a little bit later in the book, you also describe, and that's the way Paula also sees her when she's sitting there looking at this 14-year-old girl who's quite attractive. And as a father, I felt very uncomfortable, and I was like, why would you go there? And for me, and the reason I want to talk about it is because it also speaks to even Simone herself has got like a dual personality. Paula herself has got a dual personality, not to mention the other characters around her. And I was a little bit concerned.
I think it goes back to the underlying theme, really, of the Limbo trilogy, which is that we have so many secrets and that we live these parallel realities all the time. We act out our lives in a very normal, ordinary fashion, but in fact, we always keeping that darkness at bay. You know, every single... We basically, I believe, we create our own souls, and that basically at every point you have these decisions to make. And I read a quote this morning about sort of that to sort of the sane person is basically the person who's keeping the madman at bay within themselves. And I think a lot of it is about, it also goes back to the feeling that I have whenever I'm in Camps Bay, which is why Camps Bay is the location. There's the sense of...
And then you throw in Frenchmen and you describe them as black crows. And I grew up in Cape Town. I'm saying, like, on what corner is she talking about with this Frenchman dressed as black crows and they resemble black crows? And I'm like, okay, maybe I need to go back to Camps Bay.
No, I think, look, whenever you write fiction, there's an aspect of a huge aspect of the imagination. And I think, as Murakami says, a lot of, when you write fiction, it's symbolic. So these people arriving on the corner in Camps Bay, they symbolize some aspect of life, again, which we don't understand, which we put to one side, which we pretend is not there, which is the cults. And the cults worldwide, we tend to think of them as something that appears in detective fiction. The reality is there's a lot happening worldwide. I mean, it's fascinating. I did a lot of research, and it's and then people ask questions, and I'm like, yes, I'm creating a metaphor for the real world. These things are out there. They
I want to
happen.
come to that, Consuelo, because I find the book so incredibly topical. If you consider Harvey Weinstein, the latest issues against Danny Jordan, the stuff involving Kevin Bacon and young boys, and if you continue that list, but I want to talk to you about that a little bit later. But was it intentional to kind of sexualize Simone in that way and the way people perceive her?
I don't think people are frank enough about the real thoughts that people have. You know, when I sit at Camps Bay on a hot summer's day, I know
Sipping
there's
margaritas, or what's your favorite drink? No margaritas.
well, I don't drink alcohol.
Okay. Sipping a virgin
So maybe
mojito.
that makes me more aware
Yeah.
of the effect it has on others. I'm not sure, but I'll be sitting there in the sunshine, and strangely enough, I know Nordic fiction is very in. You know, where people the snow makes. To me, the snow is quite pure, and it's not menacing. To me, sitting in the broad sunshine when everybody is feeling very relaxed, and it has its own menace. The sunshine.
Because you know what, there's a point where you describe it. You actually describe it in the book where you talk about young girls and, you know, their body's not being developed, and lecherous men and leering and for me, now that you're talking, that's kind of a Camps Bay, not an every day, but at some day.
Well, I chose to use Camps Bay as my location because I felt it very much. You know, there's all those cafes on the boulevard, as Daniel calls it, her husband, and he's extremely aware of these undercurrents of this world that lies underneath, obviously because of his dual lives, but definitely to me there's a lot of wealth. You know, and wealth also allows people to do things that are maybe other people can't do. So there's that sense of, you know, the sunshine, the alcohol, the wealth, and sort of people letting go of their inhibitions. Plus, I know, you know, there's a lot of party houses in that area.
Yeah,
what I
there's
call
on
party
that strip,
houses.
yeah.
A lot of big parties. It's been part of the Cape Town scene forever. I was in Camps Bay once where this young girl, she was driving this very expensive 4x4, and she suddenly sort of braked, and a car had veered in front of her, and I think it was her father, and he sort of yanked her out the car, and it was clear she was high on drugs, high, and he was like stopping her, doing something, going somewhere or whatever. So there's a lot of, you know, real life incidents that feed into that world. I don't think that world is only in Camps Bay. It just so happens, perhaps it's close to my world, that it allowed me to use it as a metaphor for yes, and I tend to see these little looks, these things which
you describe brilliantly in the book.
yeah, which people tend to ignore. You know, people sort of, we all try to live this ordinary life where we pretend that's not happening. And I think it's incredibly important in literature to be frank about our world. And I find that, you know, sexual matters are kind of boxed as pornography. It's not that way. You can't really understand life in all its fullness if you don't take into consideration the sexual beings that we also are. You know, I think that's my view. So I try to write very frankly, very honestly. And I mean, it goes back to Henry Miller. You know, in the 60s and 70s, there was a lot of French literature writing about sort of the more sexual aspects. But these days, strangely enough, we have pornography and we have literature. And it's definitely not pornography, but it's that aspect that we are sexual beings as well as emotional beings. And how does that play off?
Yeah, you know, I know we're still talking about the relationship between Paula and Simone, because I found it very, very fascinating. I spent a lot of time when I read the book really thinking about that dynamic and how it would play out in real life, and if you really had this. But the reality is there are people, children are abused, and whether it's adopted or not or biological, there are real issues that people go through, and Simone shows a lot of that. I mean, you know, one day she'll want to be outside, the other day she's withdrawn, and she's got the cat. I keep on forgetting how to pronounce his name.
Petrushka,
Petrushka,
the full name.
yeah.
Yes.
And she's got that cat, and that cat plays such a central role for her, because even when she didn't want to school, she was allowed to take that cat with her, and it became the anchor, and then eventually
Yes.
was allowed to let her go. So you do see the evolution of Simone in one way or another, but then at the same time, she evolves and retracts at the same time, and I always find it, and when I think of as a father with a young daughter, and I think of the situations where I know where young ladies have been abused, it's that constant tug and pull, and it's the constant trying, and I can sense Paula's frustration almost in one way, because she really enjoys it when Simone looks like this ordinary girl. For example, when Sam comes around and they get to laugh and they get to play and they get to chat, but then she doesn't get to see it again.
Yes, it is. I think it's terribly important, and I think it's very much children who've gone through immense trauma in their previous lives. It's not something you can just take away. You know, it's not something you.
Where
can
does that
whitewash.
insight come from, though? What did you Where does that insight come from?
I read a lot, and I read a lot of interest. I mean, not, strangely enough, newspapers. You know, I read a lot of real life stories. I've been fascinated by missing children ever since I can remember. I grew up in a very small town in the old Transvaal. It was a small Afrikaans town, and very interesting things always happened to me. Well, when I say interesting, they probably wouldn't interest other people, but sort of the people around me. So there was a girl next door that kind of everybody suspected she was being abused, but nobody did anything about it. You know, and when I think back, I'm quite shocked and horrified, you know, but it was just how the small town was. There was an old couple across the road whose daughter had died. I can't remember to this day how she died, but one day the old woman invited me in to jump on the trampoline. And then every single time that I walked past, and I used to walk on my own in those days to a forest on the edge of town and play in the forest, she would say, come on the trampoline. And it turned out that they'd bought that trampoline for their daughter, and they used to have regular seances. So it's interest to get the daughter to have the spirit of the daughter come and talk to them. So yeah, and there was Madeleine McCann. I've always been very interested in these
Madeleine's
stories.
story is ongoing still.
Yeah, very, very.
So, you know, we're talking about relationships. So let me also talk about the relationship. And I know how I like the fact that you drop in these random characters. Like I like the lady who's in charge of the building, or I like Paula's friend who's very direct. And then she's got weird relationships with investigators that she used, a couple of hackers, all of that kind of stuff. But the most interesting relationship for me, and that is obviously doesn't get delved in as much as it in the first one, is the weird relationship with Daniel, and how she explains the pretense of she got rid of all of his stuff. She's got the picture to kind of maintain this pretense that she's in this kind of loving relationship, but for all intents and purposes, she's living her life. She's moved on.
I think it's extremely difficult for her because she's decided in her mind that he's her soulmate. And it's also
because she explains how he came back. I mean, you know, he left her for quite a long time and then just reappears.
Yes, and she's again. It's that thing, and I think it's interesting. It's that thing of having this connection to a person, and it's not always logical or rational, and you can't explain it yourself sometimes, and you'll go through amazing things for that person. I think it's also in a strange. I mean, in Lady Limbo, she actually picks up on his air of mystery. So there's always this mysteriousness about him, and I think that there's something about the dark world that fascinates and attracts us, and I wanted to show that.
I'm so glad you touched on it, because I think Paula's attracted to it.
She is very attracted to it.
Especially in this book, she's friends with a lot of shady characters.
She is very attracted. It's a huge move away from her ordinary life, and I think as you start to experience other sides of yourself which have been left untapped, I think in general human beings are very curious. So it becomes a matter of great curiosity, both in discovering herself and in, you know, and these are unusual people around her who don't operate on a normal, everyday, ordinary level. So she discovers that you don't have to be ordinary, you don't have to be normal, and then life leads you into all these. But it is also that experience that I don't know, at least for myself, there's definitely a fascination with that dark world, and you're constantly pushing and pulling, you know, and deciding who you want to be, you know.
So, you know, it's quite interesting. We're going to take an ad break in a couple of seconds, but it's quite interesting for me that you create a power lovers. For me, it's you're either going to love or hate her. You created Daniel and the psychologist or the psychotherapist, who I think is quite phenomenal. I would love to see who would play her in real life, by the way. Then you've created characters like Sam. There's Elijah. If you haven't read the first one, he comes through in some ways. There's still the old cop that used to date the stripper.
Yeah.
Then there's I think it's Rama, or how do you say?
Yes, Nelson Kwamarana.
Kwamarana,
Yeah.
So and the thing that always sticks out about me is that he's got garlic breath. You know, so you've created these characters. Then there's the French guys, and you describe them as crows, and they're black, and all these things, and you've created these characters, but you've added quirky little things to each of their personalities. Was that done on purpose? Or was that just the way the character developed?
I suppose, how can I put it? it does provide the reader with markers.
Yeah.
And I think, for instance, the garlic breath becomes an important marker.
Yes.
So that there was a point to that. But I have to say, I see these characters very, very clearly. I sometimes see them more clearly than the people I know. And I think part of that is that I know them so intimately. I know their most intimate thoughts, whereas if you think about it, you don't know the most intimate thoughts of your friends and families, of anybody you know. So it's actually very interesting. So I do know them very well, but it is a big cast.
It's a very big
It's a big cast, so you also want your readers to stay with the characters and to know who they are in some sort of deep part of themselves. And I think our quirks are very important parts of who we are. Like I have this pathology that I'm constantly reading newspapers and stripping pages and cutting, and that would be me in a book. That would be a very valid quirk of my personality. I've done it ever since I can remember. But it feeds my love for story, my sort of, so it serves a purpose. But yeah, I do think quirks are part of us. Maybe they're not always recognized.
So we're going to take an ad break. When we come back, I'm going to talk about the topical nature of the book. And then in our last segment, we really talk about the story of Simone being pursued, or the idea that she's being pursued and that she was part of the sex ring, and and that horrible topic around that they're actually people that pay to sleep with virgins. Yeah. So let's take an ad break.
brandlive.co.za.
Have you ever thought about the power of social media? Social media has the power to make your business grow. Grow! Yeah. Why don't you let us manage your social media? Because our business is to see your business grow. Visit us at www.bstownmedia.co.za.
Making a bold statement yet blending into the surrounding suburbs of Melville, 27 Boxes is a realization of edgy design and practical implementation. A radical departure from the shopping malls of our generation, yet not a return to the high streets of our youth. 27 Boxes showcases the best of a shopping centre set in a garden, surrounded by the bohemian suburb that is Melville. 27 Boxes, shop, play, eat. You're listening to brandlive.co.za.
Welcome back. You're listening to The Weekly with me, Sam Marshall. And I've got Consuelo Rowland. She's in studio talking about the second installment of a trilogy called Wolf Trap. Let me read some of the things that were said about this book. On the jacket, Amazon said it's top-notch, accessible literary fiction by a wonderfully talented author. Slipnet said Consuelo Rowland has written a surprising and intriguing tale about marriage, life, and the exceptions we make for those we love. And it's on that note I want to talk about, before we get into the plot and a little bit more of the protagonist and the antagonist, I want to have a chat to you about just the topical nature of this. And I don't know if authors are soothsayers in many ways, that they kind of have the ability to foretell the issues as they are about to unpack. Because we're talking about this book at a time when really seriously high-profile men have been outed for some of the things that they've been doing in the dark for a very long time.
I think it's just always interested me. I've always seen it ever since I was young. Maybe because I'm a woman, I was a girl. Maybe because I was aware, as I say, of things as I was growing up. And I always found that story gives one a way to talk about things that is maybe more palatable, but it get to provoke thought. I would be happy if these books provoke thought. And as I say, for me, it was very much. I've been interested in these missing children ever since I can remember. So I would go online. I would read real life cases about children that went missing, children that were found, what the circumstances were. So it is a topical subject that I have been interested in for most of my life. And probably I've had incidents myself. The times are different now where these men are being outed. And as I said just now, I do think the sexual part of our natures is not talked about enough.
One of the other things that also struck me in this book, and I think it's going to be part of that conversation where people are going to, you do ask us to look at ourselves, because you do describe the way some of the men interact with Simone. you do describe how Paula even relates her own life. And it does ask the question, what is the role that we're playing in all of this stuff? You a little bit earlier spoke about, there was a neighbor and the things were happening there, but we never questioned it. And I feel in many ways, in what Wolf Trap does, it does really talk to you about the complicity of people and the role that we play in these things, that we do see things that are untoward and never question.
Absolutely. I think it's about these two parallel dimensions that we live in all the time. I think there's many families where things are known, many friendship groups, but it's just very difficult for people to talk about these things. I mean, there's people I've known that have told me about these parties, that have told me about things like there's a red pot outside the door, the back door, or the door by the garage, and that tells the party group that this person is a member of that party group. And then the keys get put in one place and everybody takes a different key, so they swap partners. There's a lot of real, and that was told to me by somebody. We were about to go and play a game of tennis, and I was like, oh, really? How interesting. Okay. For my next book.
When I return this, when I put topspin on this, I'm going to be thinking about that red.
Well, I did, but this is the thing, I was a little girl in Piet Retief living next door to these neighbors that had this only daughter, and everybody knew what was happening. Well, it's not so much that people said we know what is happening, but there was a lot of whispers which we all heard as children, so everybody knew, but nobody did anything at all.
I've got about 8 minutes left. Let's talk more about the book. Okay, so there's a crazy thing that happens between Paula and excuse me for not remembering the names. I had a very long night. But there's a crazy conversation about whether Simone should lose her virginity. It was just a crazy conversation, because part of Paula's thinking is that Simone is being pursued, or they being pursued by these whoever they are.
These men who are holding the auction.
Yeah, holding these auctions, because Simone is a virgin. And I just, sometimes I wonder where authors go to come up with these really funny lines. And there's like this. So that was an actual conversation, whether she should actually lose her virginity. Yeah.
It was a very tough part of the book to write, a very, very tough part. And in fact, if it wasn't for Monica, the straightforward friend, I don't know if I could have. I think I rewrote that part in 100 different ways.
Because that could come off wrong.
Very wrong. And it's. But I also, in Lady Limbo and in this book, I wanted to face the tough dilemmas, and I think that would be an incredibly tough dilemma if you knew that this child was earmarked for an auction as a virgin, and the only way that you could keep her safe was to do this. So I had to go there, and it was the same. Well, in Lady Limbo, she had another dilemma, which was she going to go into that organization or not? And I think these are the dilemmas that make us stronger, that make us sort of deeply consider our lives and what is love? What does it mean? How far will you go for love? I think that is ultimately what both books are about. If you say, this is my soulmate and I will love him until the day I die, I mean, there's a whole question around that, which is, does it mean you will only love him until he dies? This whole thing of a soulmate is interesting. Or does it mean you will love him forever and you will die with that person as your soulmate? So that's still another dilemma I have to face. Yeah. So these books have been interesting because they forced me to question things very, very... and in the end, though, I have to look at it from Paula's perspective, from where she is, a single mother with this situation, this massive situation.
So was there a line that you wouldn't cross? Was there a line that you said, okay, well, I've got to, like you said now, I've got to look at it from Paula's perspective. I've got to, develop the characters in an organic way that this conversation would actually happen. Was there a line that you wouldn't cross? Because it's quite a sensitive issue to talk about a 14-year-old girl that's been groomed and kidnapped for a sex ring. And then the other difficult thing that I thought about a lot was, and this is the thing that Simone struggles with, and that I think Paula gets but doesn't really want to deal with, if they didn't take me, they had to take someone else.
That was a huge thing, and it's Paula's guilt to live with forever. So in the end, you have to go back to the characters and do your utmost. For me, it's like the characters, they direct the book. That virginity scene, I wrote it 100 times and Paula wasn't happy. So I wrote it the 101st time and the 102nd time. And I kind of knew what I wanted to get across, but I wasn't exactly sure what her decision was going to be. Really, it came from writing the scene until she was happy. And then it was like, okay, that's what I would do. Now you got it. Now you can stop writing. So you go to that depth. And Simone, I mean, she's a raging wildfire. She leads me, in the strangest places. So
The other thing that struck me, which was crazy, that there's an incident where Paula gets attacked after she goes out for a run.
yeah.
She's then saved by a mysterious person. The thing that strikes me that both Paolo and Simone are victims of crime, and that we're living in an environment at the moment where it's not inconceivable to find 5 women in a room and 3 of them have been survivors of something severe.
Yes.
And that for me was like, wow. And that's crazy.
It is crazy, and it's interesting because I run, and I've actually been very interested. Almost every person who's read the book has actually commented on that scene where Paula gets mugged while she's running. And I think, again, it's that contrast of doing something ordinary where you should be safe, and then all of a sudden that world is disrupted by some force, by some energy that you're not expecting. And it's a very disruptive force, and it's that whole... and it's that whole thing of good and bad that we struggle with all our lives, And yes, crime is extremely topical. It's part of who we are, and I think it's why suspense is taking off worldwide unbelievably. Just about 80-90% of what gets written today and read is suspense, because we live in this world full of crime, one way or the other.
So they live in this, well, Paolo and Simone, and I want to ask you, because I almost feel that their positions are different. So Simone is in the space where I'm being pursued. They want to grab me, and it kind of controls her life, right? Paula lives in exactly the same space. They want to grab my daughter. They want to do all of this, blah blah blah. But their approaches are so incredibly different to it. And I thought maybe in real life that's also how we look at things, right? Very, very differently, because there are 2 women that are affected by, not the same thing. The one is a potential victim and the other one is the mother of that victim, having been a victim of crime myself. But their approaches are so different. When you write these characters, and when you write Wolf Trap, what are the rules around keeping it, I don't want to use keeping it real, but what are the rules around the characters in how they deal with issues? Or was there no rules?
There are no rules in terms of how far I will go if my characters tell me to go there. And I honestly believe there should be no taboo subjects in literature. It is our business to find out what it means to be human. That is our business. That's what literature is about. If you don't write to have a conversation on that topic, then it's not literature, it's something else. So, coming from that perspective, in terms of their very different positions, I think it's still very important that Paula still comes from this relatively privileged, safe background, whereas Simone has suffered sexual abuse. And I do think that the trauma of that is immense. So in a sense, although Paula loves her and understands as much as possible, she's never been through something like that. So I think it's still perhaps only another woman who has gone through something like that who would really get Simone. So that might still come in book 3. But there is that discrepancy between their experiences in life. And you're absolutely right. They are in a different place as they face this experience. But I wanted to show that because I know I'm privileged in my life. I've always been safe. But I've felt others who were not safe. So it's coming from that. Yeah.
So I know we've got 2 minutes. I've got to throw a little bit forward. Okay, so Wolf Trap is done and dusted. You've had some reviews on it. Where do you take who? Okay, I want to be very strategic. Let me ask this question: who dies in this book, and who doesn't make it to book 3?
You have to read it to the end to find that out.
Who doesn't make it to book 3?
Well, I think the reader will have to read that. Yeah.
Does it? I can only imagine. I mean, is it easy to write a trilogy?
No, it's not easy. I don't think I'd ever do it again in my life, but I realize...
Because the complexity of book 2 it's quite complex, and I'm thinking, I wonder what she's got in book 3.
Book 3 is going to be incredibly interesting. I've got a sort of rough plot outline, and it's going to be very interesting. Also, because the one aspect that carries through is the aspect of the internet. So in the first book, there's the email message that she finds, which is on one of the very first chat shows in chat rooms in South Africa, which I did all this research.
I didn't even ask you about that weird conversation between Double and Butterfly.
And it's so
just a weird convo.
From that email, which caused so much ripple effect in their later lives. Then there was the chat room, the secret chat room that Simone goes on, where she has this conversation with this Diablo, who we don't know exactly who he is.
He calls himself the devil.
Yes, he calls
That's a
himself
clear
the devil.
indication that he's not a good guy.
But things are not always what they
They
seem.
seem,
So
yeah.
we're not quite sure in these books. And then in the third book, there's that whole thing of the internet continues, because now she's become part of this group in Wolf Trap that basically is sort of monitoring the internet situation. So there's that, and then there's also, again, what does love mean? How far would you go for love? That's really, I suppose, what it's all about.
Consuelo Roland, it's been beautiful talking to you for the last half an hour. She's the author of The Good Cemetery Guide, Lady Limbo, and the second installment in the trilogy. It's called Wolf Trap. It's available at all good bookstores. I know that you've got your launch tomorrow night at Isle of Books in Melville. Yeah. And so who's coming? Friends, family, fans?
A few friends. I don't know many people in Joburg, but I think, I hope. Some fans. You coming?
I'm definitely coming.
Which is good. Helen's coming. So, yeah.
Oh, where
Have
can
a good
people
evening.
where can people go to interact with you if they want to? I don't know if they want to find out more. What were you thinking when you wrote that line?
The line. Oh, I see. You have to interact with me. I have a Facebook page. I have a consueloroland.com. I have a website. So they're very welcome to interact on the Facebook page. It's called Consuelo Roland Author. So, very welcome.
Consuelo Roland, thank you for joining us on the Weekly.
Thank you so much, Sam. It was great being here.
brandlive.co.za. Harnessing the power of talk radio. brandlive.co.za.